Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that the religion you believed was eternal, unified, and unbreakable had quietly begun tearing itself apart centuries ago. Not because of one argument. Not because of one man. But because of power, language, culture, pride, fear, and a slow-burning rivalry that most people never notice until it explodes. When people hear about Christianity splitting into Catholic and Orthodox, they usually imagine a dramatic meeting, a loud argument, maybe one angry pope and one stubborn patriarch slamming doors in the year 1054. Boom. Schism. End of story, but that version is a lie. Or at least, a very convenient simplification. The truth is much more unsettling. Christianity didn't split in a moment, it drifted, it cracked, it slowly hardened into two worlds that could no longer understand each other, and the most shocking part, for hundreds of years, nobody openly admitted the split had happened. To understand why Christianity broke in two, we have to go back to a time when there was no Catholic Church and no Orthodox Church, at least not as we understand them today. There was only one church, one faith, one creed, one belief that it was the continuation of something ancient, sacred, and unchangeable, but unity, especially when stretched across continents, empires, and languages, is fragile, and Christianity was about to become the largest, most powerful religious force the world had ever seen. At the very beginning, Christianity was not Roman, it was not European, it was not even particularly organized, it was a movement, a dangerous one. Jesus of Nazareth preached in the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire, places like Judea, Galilee, and Syria. His followers were not politicians or generals. They were fishermen, laborers, outcasts. When he was executed by the Roman state, the authorities believed the problem was solved. They were wrong. Within decades, Christian communities appeared in Antioch, Alexandria, Jerusalem, Rome, and Constantinople, cities separated by thousands of kilometers, cultures, and traditions. These communities shared beliefs, but they did not live the same way. They spoke different languages. They thought differently. They understood authority differently, and yet, they still considered themselves part of the same church. At first, leadership was local. Each city had a bishop. Some cities, because of their size or importance, gained influence. Rome had prestige because it was the capital of the empire and because Christians believed Peter and Paul were martyred there. Alexandria was a center of learning. Antioch was where the word Christian was first used. Jerusalem had spiritual weight. Constantinople would later become the political heart of the empire. No single bishop ruled the others. Not yet. What held Christianity together wasn't centralized power. It was shared belief, persecution, and a sense that the world was hostile and temporary. But everything changed in the 4th century. In the year 313, Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity. Not long after, he openly favored it. Suddenly, a persecuted religion became an imperial religion. This was not a small shift. This was a transformation so massive that it would shape the future of Europe, the Middle East, and global politics for the next 1,700 years. Christianity moved from catacombs to palaces, from martyrdom to influence, from spiritual movement to institutional power, and with power came a question that would never go away. Who is in charge? Constantine wanted unity. A divided church was a threat to imperial stability. That's why he called the Council of Nicaea in 325. Bishops from across the empire gathered to define what Christians were supposed to believe. This is important, because it sets a precedent. The emperor did not invent doctrine, but he enforced unity. From this point on, theology, politics, and empire were tied together. Still, even after Nicaea, the church remained technically unified. Bishops argued. Councils debated. But East and West were still in communion. However, beneath the surface, two Christian worlds were forming. In the West, the Roman Empire was collapsing. Cities fell. Roads decayed. Education declined. Latin became the dominant language. The Bishop of Rome slowly filled the power vacuum left by imperial collapse. People didn't just look to him for spiritual guidance, they looked to him for order. In the East, the Roman Empire didn't fall. It transformed. Constantinople became the capital of a wealthy, organized, Greek-speaking empire we now call the Byzantine Empire. Here, the emperor remained strong. Administration continued. Education flourished. The church existed alongside imperial authority, not above it. This difference is absolutely crucial. In the West, the church learned to rule. In the East, the church learned to cooperate, over time. These experiences shaped how each side understood authority, hierarchy, and tradition. The Bishop of Rome, eventually called the Pope, began to see himself as the ultimate authority in the church. Not just first among equals, but supreme. In the East, bishops saw the Pope as honored, but not absolute. He was respected, yes. But he was still one bishop among others. This disagreement wasn't explosive at first. It was subtle. It lived in letters, in tone, in assumptions. Then there was language. Western Christianity spoke Latin, Eastern Christianity spoke Greek. This wasn't just about vocabulary. It shaped how theology was understood. Greek philosophy influenced Eastern thought. Precision, mystery, and paradox mattered. Latin theology leaned toward legal clarity, definition, and structure. They were reading the same scriptures, but hearing different meanings. Even the way they talked about God began to diverge, and yet, they still called themselves one church. That's the fascinating part. For centuries, Christians argued fiercely. And stayed united. They disagreed over rituals. Over fasting. Over clerical marriage. Over how to calculate Easter. Over how to phrase doctrine, but they didn't break. So what went wrong? The answer is, time. Too much time spent growing apart, too little effort to truly understand the other side, and too much confidence that unity was automatic. By the time the year 1000 approached, Eastern and Western Christians were no longer living in the same mental universe. They used the same words, church, faith, tradition, but meant different things, and both sides believed God was on their side. In the West, the Pope was becoming more powerful than any Western king. He crowned emperors. He deposed rulers. He claimed authority not just over souls, but over Christendom itself. In the East, this idea was unthinkable. No bishop could stand above the church. No man could rule universally. Authority belonged to councils, tradition, and continuity. This clash wasn't just theological, it was cultural, psychological, civilizational. Western Christianity was becoming centralized, legalistic, and hierarchical. Eastern Christianity was becoming communal, liturgical, and mystical. Neither side believed they were changing, both believed they were preserving the true faith, and this is where things become dangerous, because when both sides believe they are the guardians of truth, compromise becomes betrayal. Still, the break did not happen yet. They continued to exchange ambassadors, they continued to share communion. At least officially, they continued pretending unity existed, but the tension was building, and in the next part, we will watch that tension sharpen around one single, seemingly small phrase, one line added to a creed, that would ignite centuries of resentment. Mistrust, and theological warfare, a phrase so small most believers today have never even noticed it, yet it would help tear Christianity in two, and once that crack appeared, it would never truly close again. If you were living in the early Middle Ages, you wouldn't have felt the ground shaking. No cities collapsed. No armies marched. No churches burned. And yet, somewhere deep inside Christian theology, something fundamental shifted. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't even discussed with the people. It was a sentence, more precisely, a few added words, and those words would become one of the most explosive fault lines in Christian history. To understand why, we need to talk about something that sounds abstract, boring, and harmless, but absolutely isn't. The Nicene Creed. This creed was supposed to be the ultimate symbol of unity. It defined what Christians believed about God, Christ, and salvation. It had been carefully crafted in councils where bishops argued for years over every word. The creed was not casual. It was sacred. Fixed. Untouchable, at least, that was the idea. In its original form, the creed said that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father. Simple. Clear. Ancient, but centuries later, in the Latin-speaking West, a change appeared, quietly. Gradually. Almost invisibly, the West began to say that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, in Latin, Filioque, and from the Son. Just two words, and yet, those two words would slowly poison relations between East and West. Now, from a modern perspective, this may sound absurd. Why would anyone care so much about such a subtle theological distinction? But this wasn't semantics, this was about authority, tradition, and who gets to decide truth. In the Eastern Christian world, theology was treated with extreme caution. You did not casually change inherited formulas. The creed was the result of ecumenical councils, gatherings meant to represent the entire church. No single bishop, no region, no empire had the right to alter it alone. When Eastern theologians heard that the West had modified the creed without an ecumenical council, they didn't just see bad theology, they saw rebellion. To them, this wasn't just about the Holy Spirit, it was about Rome acting as if it had the right to unilaterally redefine Christianity. And that terrified them. From the Western perspective, things looked very different. The Latin Church believed the Filioque defended Christ's divinity against heresy. To them, this addition wasn't innovation, it was clarification. The truth had always been there. They were simply making it explicit, and Rome increasingly believed that as the Church of Peter, it had a special responsibility, and authority, to safeguard doctrine. So now we have two worlds looking at the same act and seeing completely different things. The East saw arrogance, the West saw responsibility, the East saw corruption of tradition, the West saw protection of truth. This is how schisms begin, not with villains, but with incompatible assumptions. What made things worse was that neither side communicated clearly or respectfully. The East accused the West of theological error, the West accused the East of stubbornness and resistance to clarity, and under all of it was a deeper question: does authority flow from councils or from Rome? This question haunted Christianity like a ghost, but theology alone didn't cause the break. Politics was quietly sharpening the knife. By the 9th and 10th centuries, the Byzantine Empire and Western Europe were no longer allies in spirit. They were rivals. The East saw itself as the true Roman Empire, cultured, ancient, legitimate. The West was fragmented, rough, and increasingly independent. Then came one of the most humiliating moments in Byzantine history. In the year 800, the Pope crowned Charlemagne as Emperor of the Romans. From the Eastern perspective, this was outrageous. There was already a Roman emperor, in Constantinople. By crowning a Western ruler, the Pope wasn't just making a political move. He was declaring independence from the Eastern imperial system. He was saying, in effect, we don't need you. This moment shattered whatever illusion of shared political identity remained. From then on, the Pope and the Byzantine Emperor were no longer partners, they were competitors, and competition breeds mistrust. Eastern Christians began to view Rome as ambitious and power-hungry. Western Christians increasingly saw the East as outdated, rigid, and uncooperative. Even religious practices became symbols of difference. The West used unleavened bread in the Eucharist, the East used leavened bread. The West enforced clerical celibacy, the East allowed married priests. The West emphasized legal definitions of sin and salvation, the East emphasized healing, transformation, and mystery. None of these differences alone would have caused a schism, but together, they created an emotional distance. Christians were no longer arguing like family, they were arguing like foreigners. And then came the personalities, because history doesn't just move through ideas, it moves through people. In the mid-11th century, the papacy was undergoing a dramatic transformation. Reformers believed the Church needed stronger leadership to fight corruption and secular interference. The Pope was no longer just a respected bishop, he was becoming a supreme authority. At the same time, Constantinople had its own powerful church leader, the Patriarch. Neither man wanted to submit to the other, neither believed compromise was acceptable, and both believed they were defending God's will. What followed was not a theological debate, it was a collision of egos. In 1054, papal representatives arrived in Constantinople. The meeting was tense from the start. There was no humility, no patience, no attempt to truly listen. The papal legate walked into the Hagia Sophia and placed a document on the altar, a formal excommunication. The Patriarch responded in kind, This moment is often taught as the Great Schism, but here's the twist: at the time, most Christians didn't even realize what had happened. There was no announcement to the masses. No global declaration. Life went on, but something invisible had snapped. The trust was gone, and once trust disappears, even minor disagreements become existential threats. In the years that followed, attempts were made to restore unity. Councils were held. Agreements were drafted. Hands were shaken, but the damage was deeper than doctrine. The two sides no longer trusted each other's intentions, and then came the event that would permanently destroy any hope of reconciliation: the Crusades. In the next part, we will explore how Western armies, marching under the cross, didn't just fight Muslims, but turned against their fellow Christians, and how one act of betrayal burned the final bridge between Catholic and Orthodox worlds. A betrayal so brutal that the Eastern Church would never forgive it. If the Great Schism was a crack, then the Crusades were the hammer blow that shattered everything. Up until this point, despite arguments, insults, and excommunications, there was still something holding East and West together: the belief that, deep down, they were on the same side. That they were arguing as family. That unity, however strained, was still possible. That illusion would not survive the Crusades. To understand why, we have to strip away the romantic image most people have of the Crusades. Forget shining armor, noble knights, and holy missions. What actually marched eastward from Western Europe was a volatile mix of faith, fear, greed, ignorance, and raw violence, and the Eastern Christians, the Orthodox, were about to learn a devastating lesson. In 1095, the Byzantine emperor sent a desperate message to the West. The empire was under severe pressure from Turkish forces. He asked for military assistance. Not conquest. Not crusade. Assistance. What he expected was a limited, disciplined force under imperial control. What he got instead was a tidal wave. The Pope, seeing an opportunity to assert leadership over Christendom, called for a holy war. The response was overwhelming. Tens of thousands answered the call. Knights. Peasants. Adventurers. Criminals. Fanatics. They didn't march as allies of the Byzantine Empire, they marched as instruments of God. From the very beginning, relations were strained. The Byzantines viewed the Crusaders as unpredictable, violent, and uncultured. The Crusaders viewed the Byzantines as suspicious, effeminate, and untrustworthy. They didn't speak the same language, they didn't share the same customs, they didn't even pray the same way, and yet, they were supposed to cooperate. That cooperation was fragile, and short-lived. As Crusader armies moved through Byzantine lands, they looted villages, attacked civilians, and treated Eastern Christians little differently than Muslims. To many Orthodox believers, this was shocking. These weren't enemies, these were supposed to be brothers in Christ, but the Crusaders didn't see it that way. To them, Eastern Christians were strange, compromised, almost heretical. They crossed themselves the wrong way. They used the wrong bread. They refused papal authority. In Western minds, orthodoxy was no longer simply different, it was suspicious. Still, nothing compares to what happened in 1204. The Fourth Crusade was supposed to go to Jerusalem. It never got there. Instead, through a twisted chain of debt, manipulation, and ambition, the Crusader army turned toward Constantinople, the greatest Christian city in the world, a city filled with churches, relics, libraries, and centuries of sacred history, a city inhabited by fellow Christians. What followed was one of the darkest episodes in Christian history. The Crusaders sacked Constantinople. They looted churches, they desecrated altars, they stole relics, they raped, murdered, and burned. The Hagia Sophia, one of the holiest places in Christendom, was violated by drunken soldiers. This was not war against infidels, this was violence against the heart of Eastern Christianity, and the psychological damage was irreversible. From the Orthodox perspective, this was the moment everything became clear. Rome was not a misguided sister church, Rome was a predator. No theological argument, no council, no apology could erase the memory of Western Christians pillaging the most sacred Orthodox city on earth. Unity was no longer just broken, it was unthinkable, even today. Orthodox Christians remember 1204 not as a historical footnote, but as a betrayal burned into collective memory. From that point on, every Western claim to authority sounded hollow. Every call for unity sounded like domination, and the West, instead of reflecting, doubled down. The papacy became more centralized, more confident, more aggressive in asserting supremacy. Rome didn't see itself as having caused the split, it saw itself as the true church standing firm while others refused to submit. Meanwhile, the Orthodox world retreated inward. It clung to tradition, continuity, and resistance to change. Not because it feared truth, but because it feared corruption. Each side hardened. Each side told its own story, and these stories shaped identities for centuries. The Catholic Church would define itself through expansion, missions, legal clarity, and universal authority. The Orthodox Church would define itself through preservation, liturgy, mysticism, and faithfulness to the past. Neither believed it had changed, both believed the other had fallen away. By now, the split was no longer just theological or political, it was emotional, it was cultural, it was personal. In the next part, we will explore how both sides began to rewrite history itself, how each church constructed a narrative in which it alone was the true continuation of Christianity, and how this battle over memory, identity, and legitimacy made reunion nearly impossible. By the time the dust settled after the Crusades, something profound had changed, not just between Catholic and Orthodox Christians, but inside them. The split was no longer something that needed to be argued, it was something that needed to be explained, because once separation becomes permanent, people don't just live with it, they justify it. They build stories around it. They tell themselves, and their children, and their institutions why the other side is no longer truly us. This is where the schism hardened into identity. The Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church didn't just disagree going forward. They began to remember the past differently, and memory, when shaped by trauma and pride, becomes a powerful weapon. From the Catholic perspective, the narrative was relatively straightforward. Rome saw itself as the natural center of Christianity from the beginning. Peter had died there. His successors sat on his chair. Unity, order, and authority flowed outward from Rome like spokes from a wheel. In this story, the East had once been loyal but gradually became stubborn, resistant to reform, unwilling to accept legitimate authority. Caught in endless debates about words instead of embracing clarity, the schism, in this telling, wasn't caused by Rome reaching too far, it was caused by the East refusing to follow. The Orthodox Church, on the other hand, told a very different story. In its memory, the early Church was a brotherhood of equals. Authority rested in councils, not individuals. Rome was honored, yes, but never supreme. From this perspective, the West didn't preserve Christianity, it re-engineered it. The Filioque, papal supremacy, legalistic theology, these weren't developments. They were deviations, and the sack of Constantinople became the ultimate proof. How could a church that claimed to represent Christ justify such violence against fellow believers? In Orthodox memory, the Catholic Church didn't just break unity, it betrayed it. So now we have two churches standing on the same historical ground, pointing at the same events, and telling opposite stories. And here's the crucial point, both stories made sense, within their own worlds. Neither side believed it was lying, they believed they were defending truth against distortion. This is what makes the Great Schism so powerful and so tragic. It wasn't fueled by ignorance alone. It was fueled by conviction. As centuries passed, these narratives hardened into theology, art, liturgy, and education. Catholic churches emphasized hierarchy. The Pope as shepherd of the world. Clear lines of authority. Uniformity of belief. Orthodox churches emphasized continuity. Ancient chants. Iconography unchanged for centuries. Worship as participation in timeless mystery. Even the way believers experienced God felt different. In the Catholic world, theology became increasingly systematic. Sin was defined. Confession was formalized. Salvation was analyzed. In the Orthodox world, theology resisted final definition. Mystery was embraced. Salvation was a process of healing and transformation rather than legal acquittal. Neither approach was accidental, they were shaped by centuries of divergence. And here's where something subtle but important happens. Over time, difference becomes danger. Catholics began to view orthodoxy as incomplete, lacking fullness because it rejected papal authority. Orthodox believers began to view Catholicism as distorted, adding innovations to the faith. These weren't casual opinions. They became part of spiritual identity. To be Catholic was to believe the Church must be united under one visible head. To be Orthodox was to believe the Church must remain faithful to ancient consensus, and once those beliefs are internalized, reunion feels like surrender. Still, there were attempts. Again and again, leaders tried to heal the split. Councils were called. Agreements drafted. Theologians negotiated language that both sides could accept, at least on paper, but something always went wrong. Sometimes it was politics, sometimes it was mistrust, sometimes it was fear of betrayal, and often, it was the people themselves, because unity signed by elites means nothing if the faithful don't accept it. Many Orthodox believers saw reunion as submission to Rome. Many Catholics saw resistance as disobedience, and so each failed attempt only deepened suspicion. By the late Middle Ages, Catholic and Orthodox Christians were no longer even arguing about unity, they were living separate spiritual lives. Then came another seismic shock, the Protestant Reformation. Suddenly, Catholicism itself fractured. Rome faced internal rebellion. New Christian identities emerged. And the Orthodox world watched from the outside. Some Orthodox theologians saw Protestants as fellow rebels against Rome. Others saw them as proof of what happens when tradition collapses, but one thing became clear. The Christian world would never be whole again, yet despite everything, despite bloodshed, betrayal, and centuries of separation, there remained a strange paradox. Catholics and Orthodox still recognized each other as deeply Christian. They shared saints, they shared scripture, they shared sacraments, at least in theory. The break was real, but not absolute, and this tension, between separation and similarity, kept the question alive: could unity ever be restored, or had the split become part of Christianity itself? In the next part, we'll explore how theology, not just history, locked the division in place, and why even today, one specific question still stands between Catholic and Orthodox Christianity like an unmovable wall. By the time Christianity entered the modern world, the split between Catholic and Orthodox was no longer an open wound, it was scar tissue, thick, hard, sensitive to the touch. Centuries had passed since the events of 1054, since the sack of Constantinople, since the last serious hopes of reunion. Generations had been born and died knowing only one version of Christianity, one way of praying, one understanding of authority, and yet, the divide was still there, not because people kept fighting about the past, but because the core question was never resolved. That question is simple to ask, and almost impossible to answer: where does ultimate authority in the Church come from? Everything else flows from this: every theological disagreement, every ritual difference, every failed attempt at unity. Strip away the history, the emotions, the betrayals, and you're left with one immovable object. For the Catholic Church, authority is personal and visible. Christ gave Peter a unique role. Peter's successors inherit that role. The Pope is not just a symbol of unity, he is its source. Without a final authority, Catholics argue, Christianity fractures endlessly. Interpretation multiplies. Doctrine dissolves. Truth becomes opinion. History, from this perspective, proves the point. Look at Protestantism. Thousands of denominations. Competing interpretations. No final voice. Rome sees itself as the barrier against chaos. From the Orthodox perspective, this is exactly the problem. Authority, they argue, does not belong to one man. It belongs to the whole Church, guided by the Holy Spirit through consensus, tradition, and councils. A single, infallible authority is not protection, it is temptation, temptation to innovate, temptation to dominate, temptation to confuse power with truth. Orthodoxy fears not chaos, but corruption, and this fear is not theoretical. From the Orthodox view, history already showed what happens when Rome centralizes authority too much. Doctrines emerge unilaterally. Practices change. The Church moves faster than tradition can follow. So now we have two safeguards aimed at two different dangers. Catholicism guards against fragmentation, Orthodoxy guards against distortion. Both dangers are real, both safeguards make sense, and both cannot coexist without compromise. This is why dialogue stalls, because agreeing would mean surrendering what each side believes keeps Christianity alive, even when theological language is softened. Even when mutual respect is expressed, this wall remains, and it shows up everywhere. In Catholicism, doctrine develops. It grows, clarifies, defines. The Church believes truth can be expressed more precisely over time without betraying its essence. In Orthodoxy, doctrine is received, not developed. The goal is not refinement, but fidelity. Truth does not evolve, it is entered more deeply. One side moves forward by definition, the other stands still by intention. Neither believes it is static, both believe they are faithful. This tension becomes especially clear in moments of crisis. When new moral questions arise, Catholicism tends to answer them with formal teaching. Orthodox Christianity often responds with pastoral discretion and continuity. Neither approach is careless, they are simply rooted in different understandings of authority. And this is why even modern ecumenical efforts, as sincere as they are, move painfully slowly, because reconciliation isn't about signing documents. It's about reimagining the very structure of faith, and that is terrifying. Yet something interesting happens in the modern era. For the first time in centuries, Catholic and Orthodox Christians are no longer competing for the same political space. Empires have fallen. Kings no longer bow to popes or patriarchs. The battlefield has shifted. Now, both churches face a different challenge, a secular world, a world increasingly indifferent to theology, tradition, and authority altogether. And in this new environment, the old enemy begins to look less like an enemy, and more like a mirror. Catholics look at orthodoxy and see depth, beauty, continuity. Orthodox look at Catholicism and see organization. Reach, resilience, suspicion remains, but curiosity grows. In recent decades, gestures once unthinkable have taken place. Mutual excommunications lifted. Visits exchanged. Words of respect spoken, not unity, but acknowledgement, and perhaps something more fragile, humility. Still, humility alone cannot erase centuries of separation. The question remains unanswered: can Christianity have both unity and freedom? Can authority exist without domination? Can tradition remain alive without freezing in time? Catholicism and Orthodoxy offer different answers. And as long as those answers remain incompatible, the split endures, not as hatred, but as divergence. In the next part, we will step back and ask a more unsettling question: what if the Great Schism wasn't an accident? What if it was the inevitable result of Christianity becoming too large, too powerful, and too diverse to remain one? At some point, every long argument reaches a strange moment of silence, not because the problem is solved, but because both sides begin to wonder whether the problem ever could have been solved at all. When historians step back from the Great Schism, when they strip away theology, personalities, and moral judgments, a disturbing possibility appears. What if Christianity didn't fail to stay united? What if it couldn't? Think about the scale of what Christianity became. It started as a small movement in the Eastern Mediterranean. A persecuted minority with no armies, no territory, no political leverage. Its strength was simplicity, urgency, and shared danger, but within a few centuries, it transformed into something unprecedented, a religion stretching from Ireland to Armenia, from the Baltic to North Africa, spanning dozens of cultures, languages, political systems, and historical experiences. No modern institution, religious or secular, has ever maintained perfect unity at that scale without force, and Christianity rejected force as a principle. While constantly being tempted to use it, the East and West didn't just disagree, they lived different realities. In the East, Christianity grew inside a continuous empire. Roman law never disappeared. Administration remained sophisticated. Theology was debated by educated elites fluent in Greek philosophy. In the West, Christianity inherited collapse. Barbarian invasions. Illiteracy. Fragmentation. The Church didn't just preach, it governed, mediated, organized, and survived chaos. These conditions didn't just influence theology, they shaped psychology. Western Christianity learned to value clarity, command, and structure because without them, everything fell apart. Eastern Christianity learned to value continuity, restraint, and mystery because excess power was seen as dangerous, same faith. Different survival strategies, and survival strategies harden into principles. Once that happens, compromise feels like self-destruction. Now add human nature, pride, fear, honor, resentment. Institutions are not abstract entities. They are made of people. People who remember insults. People who fear losing status. People who believe sincerely that they are protecting something sacred. Rome didn't just want power, it believed it needed power to prevent fragmentation. Constantinople didn't just resist Rome, it believed resistance was necessary to preserve authenticity. Both believed God would judge failure harshly. That belief leaves very little room for concession. So was the schism inevitable? Many historians argue yes. Not because of one argument, but because Christianity became too universal to remain uniform. Unity requires shared assumptions, but East and West no longer shared them. They didn't agree on how truth is protected, they didn't agree on how authority functions, they didn't even agree on what it means to remain faithful, and yet, neither side was wrong in an obvious way. That's what makes this so uncomfortable. The schism wasn't a battle between truth and error, it was a collision between two legitimate visions of how Christianity should exist in the world, and once that collision happened, history did the rest: wars, empires, national identities. Orthodoxy became intertwined with specific cultures: Greek, Slavic, Middle Eastern. Catholicism became increasingly global, centralized, missionary, different trajectories, different instincts. Different futures. Even today, when dialogue resumes, this difference quietly reappears. Catholics ask, how can the Church speak with one voice without a final authority? Orthodox ask, how can the Church remain faithful if one voice can override all others? Neither question is rhetorical, both are warnings. So perhaps the most honest conclusion is this: the Great Schism wasn't a single tragedy, it was a process. A slow divergence driven by history as much as belief, and maybe, just maybe, Christianity didn't split into Catholic and Orthodox. Maybe it unfolded into two forms, each preserving something the other risks losing. Unity without depth becomes shallow, tradition without adaptability becomes brittle. Catholicism and Orthodoxy embody these tensions, which brings us to a final, uncomfortable thought: what if the question isn't who was right, but what was lost when they separated? Because something was lost, and something was gained. In the next part, we'll explore what each church preserved, and what each may have sacrificed, by walking separate paths. When two people walk away from each other, it's easy to keep score: who was right, who was wrong, who caused more damage. But history rarely works like a courtroom. The Great Schism didn't produce a winner, it produced two survivors, and survival always comes with a cost. Once Catholicism and Orthodoxy went their separate ways, each began to preserve certain strengths with extraordinary intensity, while quietly letting other elements fade, not by choice, by consequence. Let's start with the Catholic Church. By centralizing authority, Catholicism achieved something no other Christian tradition ever managed: global coherence. Doctrine could be defined and enforced. Missions could be coordinated. Disputes could be settled, at least in theory, by a final voice. This allowed Catholicism to expand across continents, to absorb cultures, to become a truly universal institution. Without that structure, it's hard to imagine Catholic Christianity surviving the Reformation, colonization, or modernity. But this strength came with a price. Centralization encouraged uniformity. Uniformity encouraged rigidity. And rigidity sometimes came at the expense of local expression and spiritual diversity. For many observers, Catholicism gained order, but risked becoming mechanical. Orthodoxy took the opposite path. By resisting centralization, it preserved ancient worship with astonishing fidelity. Its liturgy today resembles that of 1,000 years ago. Its theology still speaks the language of the early Church. Its spirituality resists reduction into formulas. This continuity is not nostalgic, it is intentional. Orthodoxy believes truth is not something to be improved, but something to be entered ever more deeply. But here, too, there is a cost. Without centralized authority, Orthodoxy struggled to respond quickly to change. It often became tied to national identity. It sometimes lacked a unified voice in moments of crisis. Where Catholicism risked overdefinition, Orthodoxy risked silence. Neither path is pure loss, neither path is pure success, they are trade-offs. And the deeper you look, the more these trade-offs explain why reunion remains so difficult, because reunion wouldn't just mean agreement, it would mean renegotiating what each side believes it exists to protect. Catholics would fear losing clarity, mission, and coherence. Orthodox would fear losing authenticity, continuity, and humility, and fear is a powerful force. Still, something remarkable has happened in the last century. For the first time since the schism, both churches began to openly admit that the other preserved something valuable, not in theory, in practice. Catholic theologians began studying Orthodox spirituality, icons, and liturgy with genuine admiration. Orthodox theologians began acknowledging the Catholic Church's role in global Christianity, education, and moral engagement. These are small steps, but historically speaking, they are massive, because they suggest a shift from rivalry to recognition. Yet recognition is not reunion, because underneath mutual respect, the old question still waits: can the Church be one without being uniform? Can authority exist without domination? Can tradition survive without fear of change? These questions don't belong to the Middle Ages, they belong to now. In a fragmented world, Catholic and Orthodox Christianity represent two answers to the same crisis: how to remain faithful without disappearing. And perhaps the most uncomfortable realization is this: both answers are incomplete on their own, which leads us to a final, haunting possibility. What if Catholicism and Orthodoxy don't need to merge, but need to remember why they separated, not as enemies, but as mirrors? In the next part, we will look at the modern era, where dialogue replaces domination, and silence replaces shouting, and ask whether unity is still imaginable, or whether the schism has become permanent. There is a strange moment that happens after a long conflict ends, not when peace is declared, not when apologies are exchanged, but when both sides realize they no longer know how to speak to each other. That's where Catholic and Orthodox Christianity found themselves in the modern era. For nearly 1,000 years, they hadn't truly talked, they had debated, they had condemned, they had ignored, but real dialogue, slow, careful, vulnerable dialogue, was almost non-existent. Then the world changed, empires collapsed, monarchies fell, the Church lost political dominance, and suddenly, Catholicism and Orthodoxy were no longer fighting each other for power, they were both facing something far more unsettling. A world that no longer cared. Secularism didn't ask whether the Pope was supreme or councils were superior. It didn't care about the Filioque. It didn't care about 1054, it simply walked away, and that forced both churches into an uncomfortable position. For the first time, they were no longer rivals competing for the same throne, they were witnesses standing in the same storm. This is when the tone changed. In the 20th century, something extraordinary happened, something that would have been unthinkable for most of Christian history. Catholic and Orthodox leaders began to meet not to argue, but to listen, not to convert, but to understand, not to dominate, but to explain. The lifting of the mutual excommunications, those ancient curses hurled across centuries, wasn't a declaration of unity, it was a declaration of restraint, a signal that the age of shouting was over, and what replaced shouting was silence, awkward silence, the kind that follows when two people realize they have spent centuries misunderstanding each other, and now must decide whether they actually want to know the truth. Dialogue began slowly, painfully, because every conversation reopened wounds. When Catholics spoke of unity, Orthodox Christians heard memories of domination. When Orthodox spoke of tradition, Catholics sometimes heard resistance and immobility. Every word carried history. Every phrase risked reopening scars. And yet, something subtle shifted. For the first time, both sides began to admit something out loud: the split was not just the other side's fault. This alone was revolutionary. Catholic thinkers acknowledged that centralization had sometimes crossed into coercion. That Rome had not always listened. That power, even when well-intentioned, can wound. Orthodox thinkers acknowledged that isolation had sometimes hardened into fear. That rejection of authority could become paralysis. That preservation could slide into defensiveness. These admissions did not lead to unity, but they changed the atmosphere, and atmosphere matters, because reconciliation does not begin with agreement. It begins with trust, and trust begins when both sides stop pretending they were flawless. Still, the conversations revealed something sobering. The problem wasn't hatred, it was distance. Catholics and Orthodox no longer lived inside the same assumptions, they spoke different theological dialects. They emphasized different spiritual instincts. They even experienced time differently, one oriented toward development, the other toward continuity, so the question quietly shifted, not can we reunite, but what would reunion even mean? Would Orthodoxy accept a universal pope? Would Catholicism accept a decentralized authority rooted in consensus? Would unity mean structural change, or merely symbolic communion? No one had clear answers, and perhaps that was the most honest moment of all, because for the first time in centuries, neither side rushed to dominate the conversation, they hesitated, and hesitation, in this case, was a form of respect. But history doesn't pause. While theologians talked, the world kept moving, Christian populations declined in traditional strongholds. Faith became privatized. Moral authority weakened, and suddenly, the old division seemed almost irrelevant to outsiders, which raised a painful possibility. What if the schism outlived its significance? What if Catholic and Orthodox Christianity remained divided, not because they hated each other, but because the world no longer waited for them to decide? This realization didn't end dialogue, it intensified it, because now unity wasn't about victory, it was about survival, and yet, survival raises another question, one far more dangerous than disagreement. If unity comes, what disappears? Because every reunion changes both sides, and not everyone wants to change. In the next part, we will confront the most controversial question of all. Is the Great Schism something that should be healed, or has it become an essential part of what Catholic and Orthodox Christianity now are? There is a question that rarely gets asked out loud, because it makes everyone uncomfortable, not just Catholics, not just Orthodox, historians, theologians, believers. The question is this: what if the Great Schism is no longer a problem to be solved, but a reality to be lived with? For centuries, unity was treated as an unquestionable good. One church, one voice, one visible body. Any division was automatically considered failure, sin, tragedy, but after 1,000 years of separation, that assumption begins to crack, because the split didn't just divide Christianity, it created two civilizations of faith, and those civilizations didn't stagnate, they matured, they developed instincts, reflexes, and spiritual habits that now feel essential to who they are. This is where the debate becomes dangerous, because healing a wound is not the same as erasing a scar, and the Great Schism is no longer a fresh wound, it is a scar that shapes identity. For many Orthodox Christians, separation from Rome is not experienced as loss, but as protection. Protection from excessive legalism. Protection from centralized control. Protection from theological overdefinition. Unity, in this mindset, sounds less like healing and more like exposure. Exposure to domination, exposure to dilution, exposure to losing the very thing Orthodoxy believes it preserved when the West changed course. For many Catholics, the picture is reversed, the split is experienced as fragmentation, as unfinished unity, as a historical wound that prevents Christianity from speaking with one voice in a fractured world. From this perspective, division weakens witness, it makes Christianity look contradictory, divided, uncertain, and here's the uncomfortable truth: both instincts are rational, both are rooted in real historical experience, and neither is purely emotional. This is why even sincere calls for unity often fail at the deepest level, because unity is not just theological, it is existential. It forces both sides to ask, who would we become if this division ended? And not everyone likes the answer. There is also a quieter fear, rarely spoken, but always present: if reunion happens, who changes more? Catholics worry that decentralization could erode clarity and global coherence. Orthodox worry that submission to a universal authority would unravel centuries of spiritual continuity. These fears are not paranoid, they are historical, they are inherited. And they shape resistance far more than doctrine ever could, which brings us to a paradox: the more both sides talk, the more they realize that reunion would require not compromise, but conversion, not conversion of belief, but conversion of instinct. Catholics would need to learn restraint, Orthodox would need to learn trust. And those are not things institutions do easily, especially ancient ones. There is also a generational shift happening. Many modern believers, Catholic and Orthodox alike, do not feel the emotional weight of 1054 or 1204. They inherit the structures, but not always the trauma. For them, the divide feels abstract, almost artificial, but institutions remember longer than people, and institutional memory resists change. So where does that leave Christianity? In a strange place, closer than ever in language, more respectful than ever in tone, but still divided where it matters most. And yet, something unexpected has emerged from this long separation, a kind of honesty. Catholicism no longer claims the East is simply wrong, Orthodoxy no longer claims the West is simply corrupt. Instead, both increasingly admit something far more unsettling, that the split exposed tensions that were already inside Christianity itself, tensions between authority and freedom, between clarity and mystery, between development and preservation. The schism didn't invent these tensions, it revealed them. Which raises a final, haunting possibility: what if Catholicism and Orthodoxy are not two halves of a broken whole, but two answers to the same unresolvable question? And if that's true, if Christianity itself contains contradictions that cannot be fully resolved, then unity may not look like merger. It may look like coexistence, respect without absorption, communion without uniformity. But is that enough, or does Christianity, by its very nature, demand visible unity? That question remains open, and in the final part, we will confront it directly, not as historians, not as theologians, but as observers of a faith that changed the world and now struggles to understand its own division. If you step far enough back from history, something unsettling becomes visible. The Great Schism didn't just divide Christianity into Catholic and Orthodox, it exposed a question Christianity has never fully answered, a question that still lingers, even now: can a universal faith exist without becoming either rigid or fragmented? Because that is what the schism ultimately reveals, not a failure of faith, not a collapse of belief, but a collision between two ways of surviving truth in the world. Catholicism chose unity through structure, Orthodoxy chose fidelity through continuity. Both choices were logical, both were sincere, both were costly, and neither solved the tension completely. This is why the schism refuses to fade into history. It isn't just about 1054, it isn't just about popes or patriarchs, it isn't even just about theology, it's about how human beings try to protect what they believe is sacred. The Catholic Church looked at the chaos of history and said, without a center, everything falls apart. The Orthodox Church looked at the same chaos and said, with too much power, everything becomes corrupted. Same fear, different conclusions, and here's the uncomfortable realization most people avoid: both were right. History proved the Catholic fear real. Christianity fractured endlessly wherever authority dissolved. Interpretation multiplied. Unity weakened. History also proved the Orthodox fear real. Authority centralized too much became coercive. Faith was sometimes enforced rather than lived. Power confused itself with holiness. The schism did not create these dangers, it separated them, and once separated, each side became blind to the danger it no longer faced daily. Catholicism grew confident in definition, Orthodoxy grew confident in preservation. Each guarded its strength so fiercely that it began to mistrust the other's gift, and that mistrust hardened into identity. Today, when people ask, why did Christianity split into Catholic and Orthodox? They often expect a clean answer, a date, a villain, a mistake, but there isn't one. There is only accumulation, centuries of distance, centuries of misunderstanding, centuries of sincere people protecting different aspects of the same faith, and that may be the most tragic part. The split didn't happen because Christianity lost belief, it happened because belief became too powerful to remain simple. So where does that leave us now? In a world where Christianity no longer dominates culture, where authority itself is questioned, where tradition is either romanticized or ignored, in this world, the Catholic-Orthodox divide looks different. It no longer feels like a battlefield, it feels like a mirror. Catholics looking east see depth they fear losing. Orthodox looking west see reach they never had. Each sees in the other something missing in themselves, and that raises a final question, one more unsettling than all the rest. What if the future of Christianity does not depend on choosing one side, but on learning from the existence of both? What if the schism, instead of being healed or erased, becomes a warning about power without restraint? A warning about tradition without engagement, a warning about unity without humility. The Great Schism teaches us that faith does not break only when belief disappears, it also breaks when belief becomes absolute, when certainty hardens into identity, when protection turns into exclusion. When fear of error becomes fear of dialogue, and yet, despite everything, despite bloodshed, betrayal, and centuries of silence, Catholic and Orthodox Christianity still recognize something profound in each other, not agreement, but continuity. They see the same Christ, they read the same scriptures, they trace themselves to the same ancient church, separated, but not alien, divided, but not erased. And that may be the most honest ending possible, not a reunion, not a resolution, but a recognition that Christianity's greatest strength, its universality, was also its greatest test, and the schism was the moment that test was answered in two different ways. Whether those answers will ever converge again remains unknown. But the question they reveal will never disappear: how do you guard truth without becoming its jailer? That question split Christianity, and it is still waiting for an answer.